Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Joe Mays and J-Raff show. This is our first YouTube extra where we're going to do a little bit about the show that we're going to be talking about tonight. Some things that we don't think we'll be able to fit into the show are going to wind up here on YouTube, hence the name YouTube Extra. Justin is not with me right now. He'll be joining me tonight at 6:30 p.m. for our regular Sunday show. Again, this is the Joe Mays and J-Raff show, YouTube Extra. I am Joe Mays, one of the hosts. Tonight we're talking about who are the top 5 greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. And one of them, and one of my all-time favorites, is Dan Marino. I'm not going to tell you where I have him ranked in my list. You'll have to tune in tonight at 6:30 p.m. on Ustream or Blog Talk Radio. But Dan Marino is one of my top 5. Big surprise, I know. I'm a huge Miami Dolphins fan, so I had to include him, and I truly do believe that he is one of the greatest of all time. He may not have the rings of a player like Joe Montana, John Elway, Tom Brady, some of those people, but he did enough as a quarterback to warrant being on the list. And we'll get into more of that tonight with statistics and things like that. But I actually had a story I wanted to share on the show tonight, but don't think I'll get around to because of the time constraints. So I wanted to pop it in here and do for our first YouTube extra on the Joe Mays and J-Raff show. So I'm a huge Miami Dolphins fan, like I said, and Dan Marino, one of my favorite players of all time. I know he is for many people, and being a huge Miami Dolphins fan, that can be expected. But like I said, one of the things that people use to separate quarterbacks when you compare them to each other is how many Super Bowl rings do they have. And while I don't think that's entirely fair because football is such a team game, I mean, you're relying on 10 other people on offense, 11 people on defense, how many people on special teams, coaching, weather, conditions, opponents, things like that, that it's hard to say that one player is better just because they won Super Bowls. Trent Dilfer won Super Bowl. That's more than Dan Marino. Is he better than Dan? So I just don't think you can say rank the quarterbacks on the number of Super Bowls they won. You got to take into account the individual statistics overall throughout the entire career. Of course, Super Bowls matter, but you have to, keep it in perspective. And Dan Marino, one of the greatest of all time, but he could have easily had a Super Bowl ring. And I'm referring to the 1993 season. The Dolphins were heavy favorites in the AFC, were thought to consider a formidable challenge for the Super Bowl that year, Super Bowl 28, probably ending up playing juggernaut Dallas Cowboys from the NFC. But that wasn't meant to be, as the Dolphins didn't even make the playoffs that season. And a big reason for that was the loss of Dan Marino. In Game 5, I believe, against the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland, Dan Marino, during a normal play, crumpled to the ground, grabbing his ankle. He hadn't even been touched by a single Cleveland Browns player, but he had torn his Achilles tendon. He was off to a magnificent individual and team start, whereas the Dolphins were, like I said, 4-1 at the time. But they didn't actually fall off the cliff right away after the Dolphins' the season-ending injury to Marino. Scott Mitchell filled in admirably, and they were actually 9-2 at one time. One of those wins coming against the Philadelphia Eagles in Philadelphia, a game I actually attended, and I was hoping to see Dan Marino play for my first time, and what would be the only time I saw him play. And he was on the sideline on crutches. But I saw the Dolphins win. I believe it was 19-14 in mid-November. And Scott Mitchell actually got knocked out of that game by the Eagles defense. I don't even remember the quarterback that took over for the Dolphins. But the Dolphins ended up holding on to win 19-14, and it was, I believe it was a milestone win for Coach Don Shula as well. But anyways, the Dolphins were 9-2 and ended up losing their final 5 games. And we all know what happened. Buffalo Bills went on to win the AFC Championship and went to the Super Bowl against the Cowboys as expected, and the Bills just got smacked in Super Bowl 28. But that 1993 Dolphins season is one of those what-ifs in not just Miami Dolphins lore, but also the lore of Dan Marino, one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the game. I really think if he hadn't gotten injured, that Miami easily would have made the AFC Championship game. He was having, like I said, one of his best statistical seasons since early in his career, since really the 1984-1985 seasons when the Dolphins were so strong because of the play of the young Dan Marino at quarterback. But this 1993 season was off to a great start, and I really think some great things were going to happen, but we'll never know. It's one of those what-ifs that just hangs around sports teams every single year. There's always that injury, this play, this or that happened that you just say to yourself, what if? I mean, and this is one of the big ones, especially in Dolphins history. Dan Marino never got to a second Super Bowl. He went there as a sophomore after the 1984 season, and they lost to the 49ers. But Dan Marino never returned, but in my eyes, he's still easily one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. Find out where I rank him tonight on the Joe Mays and J-Raff Show, episode 15, 6:30 p.m. tonight again, Sundays, Ustream or Blog Talk Radio, Joe Mays and J-Raff. I'm Joe Mays. Thanks you for tuning in to our first YouTube Extra.